Good afternoon, everybody. This afternoon's proceedings are being transmitted, but only after the usual 10 minutes have elapsed since the recording was made. Those with mobile devices may use them to report what they hear in the hearing room, but only after 10 minutes have elapsed since the event that they're reporting. They may not be used for recording or photography. Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Repeat after me. I do solemnly. Sincerely and truly. Declare and affirm. That the evidence I shall give. Shall be the truth. The whole truth. And nothing but the truth. I'd like to sit down.
Thank you, Mr. Nineham. Thank you for coming to give evidence to the inquiry today. We'll have an afternoon break in the middle of the afternoon, but if you need a break at any time, please do just say. You've made a witness statement to the inquiry dated the 17th of April 2025. It's at UCPI 5037794, tab A1 of your bundle, sir. Can we go to the last page of that, please? There's a privacy box redaction over your signature, but can you confirm that you signed that statement?
I did.
And is the contents of that statement true and accurate to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is.
I'm not going to ask you about every single thing within the statement because that statement stands as your evidence to the inquiry, but I am going to ask you some questions about some topics within it. Mr. Nineham, we have limited time this afternoon, as you know, and we've spoken about trying to keep your answers focused and concise so we can consider all of the material. And I know that you're well aware of that, and I'm grateful for your assistance and cooperation in that regard.
I'll do my best.
I want to start with just some background about your political activism, please. Generally speaking, how would you describe yourself in terms of being a political activist? What do you mean by the term political activism?
I'm a socialist, and I'm involved in, and have been involved in, organising protests of different kinds. I'm also a writer. I've written on matters concerning politics in general, but also the sort of big movements that I've been involved in over the last few decades. And one of the things that I've been most involved in is kind of coordinating and organising some of the big protests, particularly anti-war, but not just anti-war protests over the last few decades in Britain.
Thank you. I want to look first, please, at the Socialist Workers' Party, if I may. You were a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. When did you join?
In 1985, I think.
Why did you choose to join the SWP at that time?
Partly it was a result of the experience of the miners' strike, actually, which had quite a big effect on me, but also I think the Falklands War had a big impact as well, and those two things together led me to believe that there was things about the way British politics was run that were deeply kind of dysfunctional, and I felt that there needed to be real opposition to the direction society was going in at the time.
You say in your witness statement at paragraph 3.1, page 6, that in 1993 you were a rank and file member of the SWP, and you described yourself as an ordinary regular party activist. What do you mean by that, in distinction to what?
I mean, I wasn't employed by the organisation. I was just a regular member of an organisation that had a number of thousands of members. I operated at a local level in, where the area I lived. I didn't have any kind of national role.
Thank you. You say in 1997 you became a full-time organiser, first in Hackney and then in South London. And you say full-time organisers were appointed by the SWP to the Central Committee. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what the role of a full-time organiser was?
Sorry, I think there's a slight confusion. I don't know if it's in my statement because I'm not reading it, but the reality is not that full-time organisers were members of the Central Committee, but that they were appointed by the Central Committee.
I see.
That's the role of an organiser was to coordinate the members in that particular area, to make sure they were meeting regularly, discussing what they were doing, getting feedback from experiences of protests and campaigning and meetings, and trying to make sure that the operation, it was a two-way process really, trying to make sure that what was happening locally, kind of broadly speaking, aligned with the overall aims of the organisation nationally, but also making sure that local experience was fed back to the elected national leadership, so that people understood, how the kind of policies were playing out on the ground.
Was it an influential position, so far as you were concerned, in terms of driving policy and strategy?
Not particularly. I was a local organiser at the time. At the time you're talking about, in 97, I was just a local organiser.
Thank you. You say at paragraph 3.4, page 7 of your statement, in 2000 you were elected as a member of the Central Committee of the SWP. What was the role of the Central Committee? Just explain that a bit further.
Well, as you say, the Central Committee is kind of the leadership body. It's elected by the membership, and its role was to, or is to, set policy between conferences and national meetings of the organisation, to kind of carry out the decisions that are made by the organisation as a whole, to give some sort of leadership to the organisation between conferences, and to make sure that those policies are kind of disseminated insofar as is possible through the organisation. Also to listen to the experiences of local members on the ground and adapt accordingly.
And so would you say that was a more influential role within the party?
Definitely.
And in terms of policy and strategy and the direction of the party?
Yeah.
Thank you. How would you, at this time, have described the SWP and its aims and objectives?
Well, the SWP is a socialist organisation, was a socialist organisation, a Marxist organisation, whose aim is, whose fundamental practice is really focused on trying to build and organise two things. One is, and the most important element, is really opposition and organised protest and campaigning against the kind of what is regarded at the time as being the most egregious examples of injustice or exploitation or war, very often, that is being undertaken by the government. So it's very much a campaigning organisation, and its campaigning is very often done in association with other organisations, trade unions, other elements of the left, and other organisations. And then on the other hand, kind of promoting a broad critique of the way society, capitalist society, is operating and some of the big problems that it's creating. And so at this time, there was a big focus on kind of corporate capitalism, and there was a broad kind of feeling in society that things were, at least sections of society, that there was real problems with the way, the kind of corporatisation of society. And of course, very soon afterwards, there was the war on Iraq and Afghanistan, and the SWP was very, very central to organising resistance, both physical and intellectual, to those two aspects of the world that we lived in.
Was and indeed is the SWP a democratic organisation?
Yes.
You remained a member of the Central Committee from 2000 to 2008. What were your responsibilities during that time as a member of the Central Committee?
Two things mainly. First of all, I was involved in the wider campaigning around what was at the time called the anti-globalisation movement, or sometimes called the anti-capitalist movement, which was a very, very big movement that emerged at the end of the last century, very end of the last century, and sort of started to become quite kind of high profile at the beginning of this century, 2000, 2001 and onwards. And I was, for, I don't know, almost accidental reasons, I was quite involved in that. So I was someone in the SWP who had a specific responsibility for being part of that and putting certain arguments inside that. And then secondly, following on from that, when after 9/11 we saw the invasion of Afghanistan and then the invasion of Iraq, and obviously very big anti-war movements, and I became one of the people, amongst others, in the SWP who was playing a role in that broader movement.
Thank you. So the sorts of actions and the sorts of demonstrations that the SWP, you and the SWP, were organising or participating in during this time would have been anti-capitalist or anti-war. Anything else?
I mean, there was, there's always other things happening. I'm sure there was workers' action and strikes that were taking place that we would have supported and organised solidarity for. No doubt other things as well. But my particular focus in terms of being a member of the Central Committee of the SWP was on the sort of broad, the anti-globalisation movement and the anti-war movement. Those were the things that absorbed most of my time.
And so in relation to the anti-war movement in the UK, the work that you were involved in as an SWP full-time organiser and Central Committee member at this time would have concerned things like, and you deal with this at paragraph 3.7 at page 9 of your statement, the first Stop the War demonstration on the 18th of November 2001 under the slogan, "Don't attack Afghanistan, justice not revenge." Is that right?
Yeah.
And a historic march against the Iraq war in the demonstration on the 15th of February 2003. Were you involved in that?
Yeah.
And then between March and May 2003, there were various protests during and after the invasion of Iraq. You say, and you would have been involved along with other SWP members in those demonstrations. Is that right?
I would, and just to be clear, those demonstrations were organised by a much broader coalition, the Stop the War Coalition. So I was acting as a member of the SWP, but I was elected actually within the broader movement to be one of the organisers of those demonstrations, and I was actually chosen to be the head steward of those demonstrations.
What did you see as the key features of anti-war demonstrations at the time?
Well, for us, actually for everyone really, I mean, the thing that really marked them out was their size and therefore their kind of social reach, and we hoped their social impact or their political impact. And this was partly a product of the fact that there was a kind of spontaneous sense of concern and anxiety and anger actually over the Afghan and Iraq wars in society, but also this was partly a deliberate, a result of our, we hope, a result of our deliberate kind of strategy or policy, which was to build the biggest possible, broadest possible movement that reached into society as deeply as it possibly could.
And in the latter part of the 2000s, 2006 to 2011, You say in your statement that the Stop the War Coalition was also mobilised in solidarity with Palestine and Lebanon, especially during the 2006 Lebanon War and subsequent Israeli attacks on Gaza. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
And did those protests have the same features as the other anti-war protests that you were involved in?
They did. They were very big. The 2006 demonstration against the Lebanon War is kind of forgotten historically, but actually it was a very, very big demonstration, and there's an argument that it was the demonstration that finally forced Tony Blair to resign, or certainly it was part of that process. The Palestine demonstrations involved a similar coalition, but actually involved even wider, not necessarily wider forces, but slightly different array of organisations of different kinds. But yes, they all were the product of alliances between the widest possible range of different actors and different organisations, with a view to mobilising on the streets the biggest possible expression of what was very often in this period a majority opinion that the government had got things wrong.
Thank you. I'm going to come to some of the individual reports in relation to some of those demonstrations in a further detail in due course, but I just want to ask you about the other two organisations that you were involved in. Firstly, can I ask you about Globalised Resistance? You were one of the founding members of Globalised Resistance. The idea for the organisation having originated within the SWP, but having quickly expanded to include a broad coalition of other groups, individuals, trade unions and NGOs, you say at paragraph 3.9, page 10 of your statement. Is that right, that it started in the SWP and originated there, and was it you and Guy Taylor who were founding members of Globalised Resistance?
Yeah, I mean, it's right in a sense, but it's also worth saying that Globalised Resistance was a product of a movement that already existed, that was growing internationally, and so it wasn't something that we plucked out of our heads, in the sense that it was similar things have been happening in countries across Europe and the world, and so we took some of the international experiences and actually in Europe and elsewhere. In some ways, the movement emerged quicker than it did in Britain. So it wasn't just a sort of brilliantly original idea. It was something that was kind of replicating organisation that was happening anyway. And yes, we kind of proposed it, if you like, to the wider movement as something we thought was a good idea, and we, from the start, tried to involve as many of the different possible components of the movement that we felt we could.
And Guy Taylor was a founding member with you. Was he a friend of yours at the time?
Not particularly. He was a member of the SWP. I don't think I particularly knew him. I mean, I might have known him, but he wasn't a friend. But he became a friend.
Thank you. You mentioned in paragraph 3.9 that the coalition expanded to include other groups, including trade unions. What connection did you have to the trade union movement?
Well, previously I'd been working as a technician in the BBC, and I'd been involved in the organising in trade unions in broadcasting previously. So I had some knowledge of that aspect of the trade union movement, and actually that led me to have a certain kind of familiarity with trade unionism. And then once we sort of started to, and also I'd been a member of the SWP that is engaged very much with the trade unions anyway. And then with the establishment of Globalised Resistance, we kind of tried to reach out as systematically as we could to those elements of the trade union movement who felt there was some significance and sympathised with the anti-globalisation movement, which was quite serious. I mean, if you look around the world, this movement that developed at the end of last century had a very strong trade union component within it. So once again, we were kind of picking up on a trend that already existed, but trying to make it, give it the maximum kind of, reality.
And was it through Globalised Resistance that you first came to meet HN 118 Simon Wellings?
Yes.
And how well, I'll come to the detail of his reporting in a moment, but how well did you get to know him in relation to his involvement in Globalised Resistance?
I mean, he was quite involved, so I knew him as a kind of colleague and a comrade, but not much more than that. I mean, occasionally we probably, with others, went for a drink or a meal after a particular event, but beyond that, I wouldn't say I was a friend of his.
Globalised Resistance was founded at, I think you said, was it 1999 or the early 2000s? Is that right?
I think it was the early 2000s.
Early 2000s.
In the year 2000.
And in terms of, you've talked about the global movement, but in terms of Globalised Resistance in the UK and you as founding members, what were the aims and objectives so far as you were concerned of Globalised Resistance?
Trying to give some organisational coherence to what was a widely felt view that the corporations in general, capitalist corporations in general, were causing a lot of damage and were too influential in society, and even to the extent of having a corrosive effect on political life. And so I think there was a widespread feeling that environmentally, in terms of trade union rights, in terms of individual freedoms in society and democracy itself, there was this widely discussed feeling that corporate power had become too influential and was beginning to really cause a lot of damage to society.
You say that it had started with members of the SWP. Generally speaking, how linked was it to the SWP? Was there a degree of independence, or was it very closely associated?
There was a strong degree of independence, and that was something that we, everyone involved, insisted on rightly, both people in the SWP and people not in the SWP. I mean, we had a series of meetings with individuals and organisations to try and set up this new network. That involved setting up a steering committee. It involved having annual conferences at which supporters and members would elect or re-elect a steering committee or a new steering committee. It had financial independence. It had its own finances. So yeah, it was an independent organisation. Although there were quite a lot of SWP members involved in it, and there were a number of SWP members on that steering committee. All the time, actually.
Can we look at a document, please, at MPS 0027847, and it's at tab B73 of the bundle. This is an intelligence report entitled Globalised Resistance Relationship with the Socialist Workers' Party. And the report sets out at the top that it seeks to explain the relationship between the SWP and Globalised Resistance, described as the London-based anti-capitalist group. And in that second paragraph, it says this: GR is often described as a front organisation of the SWP, or the anti-capitalist arm of the SWP. And whilst there is more than a considerable amount of truth in this assertion, it may be of use to clarify the exact relationship between the two. And then the next paragraph talks about Mr. Taylor and you in the wake of the Seattle anti-capitalist protests being instructed by the Central Committee of the SWP to go off and build a broad-based anti-globalisation / anti-capitalist movement. It continues with some information about the Central Committee and an assessment of the situation. And it continues further down in the middle of that paragraph. Nineham remained in his position at the SWP Centre, but was and also remains centrally involved in every aspect of globalised policy. The SWP's real control comes via the steering committee of GR. It is dominated by party activists, and of course Taylor remains a fully paid up party member, and being in the office full-time has a huge influence on the day-to-day running of things. Further down it says Nineham acts as the conduit from the SWP Central Committee, and where necessary, this is where the party is able to inject influence and steer the group in a particular direction. In truth, though, little direction needs to be given. Both Taylor and Nineham have an enormously long pedigree of revolutionary Marxist activism. It continues, this system can be effectively evidenced by the existence of the pre-meets where Taylor and Nineham draw together those members of the steering committee who are party members and plan how they want the real steering committee meeting to go. And it continues in a similar vein about essentially the theme being that the SWP, through perhaps most directly you and Mr. Taylor, control the direction and influence the policy of globalised resistance. And I just want to ask you how accurate this report is. Do you agree with the characterisation of the relationship between the two organisations as set out in this report?
No, not at all. I mean, the whole thing is couched in a kind of McCarthyite, sort of sinister, manipulative kind of caricature of how the left operates, which is absolutely not the case. And anyone who's ever been involved or ever thought about the process of building alliances would know this is utter rubbish. What we're talking about is the attempt to build a broad-based campaign, or as broad a based campaign as was possible to build around these general ideas, which, as I say, is something that had been achieved in lots of parts of the world to the extent that hundreds of thousands, even millions of people were involved in being mobilised. And you cannot create an alliance with groups like trade unions, NGOs like War on Want, people in the Labour Party, people in the Green Party, by pulling the wool over their eyes. They're just not going to wear it. If you actually end up wanting seriously to construct this kind of organisation, it has to be something that people feel comfortable in and they don't feel they're being manipulated in. And that is exactly what we were trying to construct. And this idea that there's something odd about SWP members being on the one hand involved in a broad coalition and on the other hand meeting amongst themselves as if that's something sinister. I mean, there were people in the Labour Party who were part of globalised resistance, and I'm sure they met at times with other Labour Party members. And no one would call that sinister or suggest that that was in any way sinister or manipulative. It's just part and parcel of building coalitions. That's how coalitions work.
Thank you. So you disagree, I take it, with the characterisation of globalised resistance as a front organisation for the SWP?
Well, it's not that I disagree with it, it's just not true.
And Simon Wellings, in his witness statement, MPS 07-48847, at paragraph 137, page 50, has said that essentially the SWP set up globalised resistance as a spikier, more youthful organisation, and by that I think he intended to mean one more willing to engage in action that might lead to criminal activity or disorder. Would you agree with that?
No, not at all.
Did you do the types of things that are mentioned in this report, have secret pre-meetings or nominate particular comrades to be ready to answer difficult lines of questioning if a non-party individual raised them?
I mean, we had, as I say, as every organisation does who's involved in some kind of alliance, there were times when we met as members of the SWP to discuss the way the coalition was going and even how we could influence it, because clearly we wanted to put certain arguments at different times about how we should operate. But the idea that we trained people up to answer particular lines of questioning is, again, ludicrously sinister and massively overestimates the extent to which we were organised and sort of, you know, on top of the situation. This was a fast-moving, broad movement that was beginning to mobilise large numbers of people, and therefore was much more of an open process than Simon Wellings suggests.
Simon Wellings suggests, and just for reference, it's at paragraph 85, page 30 of his statement, that even though the SWP wanted publicly to maintain a distance between it and GR was a more direct action and youth-focused organisation that was effectively subordinate to the SWP. Would you say that that's accurate or inaccurate?
It's definitely inaccurate in the sense that there was no way that GR could have been subordinate to the SWP. As I say, it was run by an elected committee that was that had, I don't remember exactly, at different times up to 20 people on it, representing significant organisations, including trade unions, who would simply not allow that to have taken place. So I completely disagree with that. Insofar as it was aimed at attracting young people, I don't see that as being, that was no doubt part of the general approach of the organisation as a whole.
Was it a more direct action focused organisation than the SWP? Would you agree with that part?
Not really, in the sense that I don't think the SWP, while it didn't prioritise direct action, I don't think the SWP had any problems with direct action at all. So I think it was more an organisation specifically designed to, as I say, to bring some sort of strategic coherence to what was a wide political mood and a kind of emerging movement that was objecting to the way that corporate power, as I say, was kind of impacting on society.
Simon Wellings describes you and Guy Taylor as de facto leaders of globalised resistance. Would you agree with that?
We were elected leaders.
And did you
amongst others?
Yes. Did you take your direction from the SWP's Central Committee?
In terms of the kind of things that we argued within globalised resistance, yes, to a certain extent. I was a member of the Central Committee. We had discussions about what we thought, the way we thought things should go if possible. But when it came to translating those priorities into globalised resistance, we won some, we lost some, because that's the way discussion and voting goes. So, there were things, we had lots of big arguments. Anyone who was involved in the whole process will know we had lots of very big debates, both in the conferences and in meetings and in the steering committee of globalised resistance about things that we should do and things that we shouldn't do. And everyone knew the SWP probably had, and I don't necessarily remember them all at the moment, but SWP probably had particular suggestions and sort of strategic ideas, but we didn't always win them in the organisation.
There's a report at MPS 0036507 at tab B88 of the bundle. We don't necessarily need to bring it up, but it's a profile of privacy, and if you want to know the name under the privacy redaction, the document is number 2 on the cipher list that you have beside you. But I just want to get your comment on this. This is a member of GR, and it states she's not a member of SWP. She will never be brought into the heart of things by Guy Taylor and Chris Nineham. And paradoxically, privacy is one of the few GR steering committee who would argue that GR is not a front organisation for the SWP, when of course it is very much, the report states. You disagree that GR is a front organisation for the SWP. Would the fact that a member of globalised resistance not being a member of the SWP prevent you and Mr. Taylor from bringing her into the heart of things, as this suggests?
No.
I just want to look then at one further report. Can we look at MPS 0037026, tab B114, Sarah, of your bundle? And again, this is a report about globalised resistance and preparations for the European Social Forum, the ESF. And it says, it details a great deal of tension between all the various groups, and it says this: as might be expected, The SWP is desperate to maintain as much influence as possible. They have been up to all of their old tricks, packing meetings to win crucial votes, holding secret meetings to formulate strategy and then denying they have taken place, exploiting personal relationships to influence others, and just good old-fashioned bullying and intimidation. Do you have any comment on the contents of that report?
I just don't recognise it as what happened at the time. I'm not saying there weren't lots of arguments and debates, there were, but this idea about exploiting personal relationships, and it's just not part of the kind of operation that went on at the time.
This then seems to be a theme of these various examples of reports of you and indeed Guy Taylor as members of the SWP and you as a central committee member seeking to, in some way, in some sinister way, to control globalised resistance and as globalised resistance as a front organisation. And that, as I say, that seems to be a theme through these reports and Simon Welling's reporting. Why do you think he sought to portray that type of picture when on your account it's not true?
Well, I mean, that's obviously a very good question. I think what it suggests to me, and it's something I have been thinking about, is that, it reflects stereotypes in society about the way that the far left organises and operates. And it suggests to me, I think, that perhaps one of the roles that undercover, or certainly this particular undercover officer had in their mind was to help give evidence to promote the kind of demonisation of far left organisations, to provide ammunition to this image that is widely circulated of a manipulative, secretive, type of organisation as being characteristic of the left. So I suspect there's an element of that. There may also be an element of, I don't know how to put it exactly, but self-justification in terms of if what he said is true, which it wasn't, then it kind of maybe gave his employers a reason to continue to fund his operation.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to move on to the Stop the War Coalition, please. You were a founding member of the Stop the War Coalition, is that right?
Yeah.
You worked with Guy Taylor. Was he also a founding member?
Guy Taylor was more involved in globalised resistance. I think he was probably a member of Stop the War, but he wasn't central to it.
Thank you. You say in your statement at paragraph 2.1, page 2, that the Stop the War Coalition was founded 10 days after the 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington in 2001. Why was it founded?
It was founded because a number of us felt that the horrific events on 9/11 were going to lead to perhaps equally horrific and possibly even more serious responses from the US and possibly Britain. In other words, we were very, very worried that it would be used as a reason for lashing out and for attacking different countries, which is exactly what turned out to happen.
Briefly then, can you explain, so far as you are concerned, what the aims and objectives of the Stop the War Coalition were?
To stop that process taking place, to stop the possibility of the West launching wars on countries in the Middle East or Central Asia, which is what we feared.
What happened at the founding meeting?
Well, we decided with a few other people to launch a new campaign, a new coalition. We got in touch with some leading figures in the peace movement, in the Muslim community, on the left, and we kind of announced a meeting. I think it was literally 10 days after 9/11, the meeting. We booked one of the biggest venues in central London, and we just publicised it, and in a way we were just like seeing what would happen. At that meeting, which was at the Quaker Meeting House in Euston Road, not only was the main hall full, which I think held maybe 1,500 people, but there were other halls that we had overflow meetings in, and even there was an overflow meeting in the Euston Road outside. So we were overwhelmed by the response. There must have been 3,000 people came to that first meeting.
As the name suggests, it was a coalition, formed as a coalition. What was the nature of the coalition? Was it narrowly based again on the SWP, or was it broader than that?
Well, as I say, I don't think globalised resistance was based on the SWP in the way that Wellings claims at all. But the Stop the War Coalition, because of the kind of absolute shock that these events had created, was even broader, was way broader actually than globalised resistance in terms of the forces that it brought together very, very quickly, including trade unions. Most of the British trade unions signed up in the weeks or months that followed. Lots of people from the Labour Party, the Labour left, were in particular, but even beyond the Labour left, some of them spoke at that initial meeting. There were people from the peace movement, there were people from Christian groups, there were people from large sections of the Muslim community, Muslim organisations who came on board. There was an absolutely huge number of organisations and individuals who came to that first meeting, and then a follow-up meeting we had a few days later, which was a kind of to try and create some sort of organisation, some sort of structure out of the initial impetus. But it was a very, very broad campaign that came to obviously mobilise millions of people, and as much as possible tried to reflect and represent what became majority opinion in British society against the Afghan and Iraq wars.
So was the Stop the War Coalition then formally constituted and a leadership elected?
Yeah, a follow-up meeting or two follow-up meetings.
And were you elected as a leader from the very beginning?
I was elected as one of the officers, yes.
And how many were there, just to give a sense of how big that group was?
Well, there was two. There was as well as the conferences that were broadly open conferences. There was sort of two levels of leadership. There was a steering committee that met at different periods at different times, but probably met pretty much once a month, which I guess which represented all sorts of different organisations, and probably had about 40, 50 people on it. And then there was what was called an officers, and still is actually, called an officers group, which was elected from the steering committee to carry out the kind of day-to-day, week-to-week work, which normally, I think it probably has on it about 18 or 20 people now, and probably did roughly the same at the time.
So can I just unpick that a little? I think that you said the Stop the War Coalition held national conferences. Was that around every 12 to 18 months?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? At those conferences, a steering committee was elected. Is that right? What was the purpose of the steering committee? What was the role of a member on the steering committee?
To develop policy, to analyse the situation with the war or wars at the time, to develop policy and strategy for the movement, and kind of chart a way forward in terms of what are the main issues we should be pursuing, what are the main slogans we should adopt, what are the main tactics we should use, when we should have our demonstrations, the sort of broad brushstroke of the running of the organisation.
And there was then, you said, a small officers group which met more often, weekly or fortnightly, and you say in your statement at paragraph 2.4, page 2, to guide the day-to-day work, and you were elected to this group and became vice chair of the officers group, is that right?
Yeah, vice chair of the coalition, yeah.
And what did the day-to-day work of that small officers group involve in practice?
So much. I mean, making sure that the demonstrations took place, getting involved with the absolute detail of the demonstrations, who should speak on them, where they should go, relations with the police, but also thinking about organising public meetings around the country, any other protests that would take place, all of those kind of detailed, concrete, organising matters.
Thank you. You also served as Chief Steward at demonstrations, is that right? What was the role of a Chief Steward in terms of the Stop the War Coalition? What was your role as Chief Steward?
Partly having a role in the setting up and the negotiation around the demonstrations, the routes, selecting routes, infrastructure, as I say, publicity, slogans, all of those things. And then in the run-up to the demonstration, organising groups of stewards to make sure that the demonstrations took place safely, took place along the lines that we wanted them to take place, to make sure there wasn't any issues on the day. Making sure as well that they were kind of coherent, because one of the purposes of the demonstration obviously is to project a certain set of arguments and certain set of demands. So one of the things we always try to ensure is that the first part of the demonstration very clearly represented the demands that we were putting at that particular time. Don't attack Iraq, no war in Iran, whatever it might be. So it's to make sure that they were organised and orderly events without being boring or staid. I mean, they were quite boisterous demonstrations. They had a carnivalesque sort of feel to them, but at the same time, they were disciplined in the sense of being very, very focused on trying to put across our message and to try and leverage the attendance on the demonstration to put pressure on the government.
And you say there was demonstrations in 2001, and then the first really significant demonstration, your first massive demonstration, you say at paragraph 2.9, page 4 of your witness statement, took place in November 2002 against the threat of attack on Iraq, when some 250 to 300,000 came out on the streets. Is that right?
It is. Doesn't sound like a monster demonstration by today's standards. At the time, it was very, very big, and people hadn't seen anything like it for many, many years.
And did you act as Chief Steward for that demonstration?
Yes.
And what was your role in relation to that demonstration as a steering committee member?
Well, I was involved in the negotiations with the police, but I was also involved in all the discussions around where the demonstration should go, what should its symbolic impact be, what should its slogans be. I was involved in helping to organise the mobilisation for the demonstration, the publicity, the promotion, alongside many others. I wasn't, and then on the day, making sure that it all passed off safely and in an orderly way, with the greatest possible impact.
I want to ask you a little bit more detail about the liaison you say you had with the Metropolitan Police Service in relation to these type of demonstrations. You say at paragraph 2.10, page 4 of your witness statement, that you engaged in dozens of meetings with the Metropolitan Police through the Tranche 3 period to agree routes for the demonstrations and protests against the Iraq war. Can you tell us, in terms of from the Stop the War Coalition side, who attended as well as you? Was it just you, or were there others?
There was definitely others.
Just being careful with names.
Yeah. Well, there was normally, I would say there were at least 2 others, pretty much always, and sometimes maybe 3 others. That we'd have a team going into the negotiations, which the police also had. There would normally be 2 or 3, and sometimes more on the police side as well.
And in terms of who attended from the MPS side, I can well understand you may not necessarily remember names, but how many? You said 2 or 3, or was it more or less than that?
Normally, I'd say it was a minimum 2, but normally there'd be at least 3, and sometimes, especially when there was anything difficult or contentious, they might have a team of a number of others, including people specialising in, for example, transport or road closures. Specialists, members of the police would come along as well. And
in terms of the police officers attending, of what sort of rank were they?
Well, a mixture. There was police liaison people. As I say, there were sometimes sort of traffic police people with responsibility for traffic and transport. And then there would normally be, I would say, a senior member of the public order team present at almost all of the meetings.
And do you have any idea of the sort of rank of that senior person?
Chief inspectors and above, commanders sometimes.
Thank you. In terms of the purpose of these meetings, you mentioned to agree routes for the demonstrations and protests against the Iraq War. Was that the primary purpose, the only purpose, or was there a more general or different purposes?
Normally that would be the main question, would be where the demonstration was going to go. And sometimes there'd be discussions and debates about that and arguments even. And those were and sometimes there was, just occasionally, maybe we'll come on to it, there'd be a kind of breakdown and disagreement and failure to agree on those issues. But they were, broadly speaking, those are the central questions.
And so that seems to be the police seeking information from you about the route you wished to take and whether they agreed or wanted to give some input into that. Is that right?
Yeah.
What about numbers of demonstrators? Would they be asking for information about how many people you expected?
Yes, they would, yeah.
And were you happy to give all of that information?
As far as we were able to, and in some cases there was quite strong disagreements about numbers.
Was there any other information that you were particularly concerned to pass on to the police or draw to their attention in terms of these types of protests and demonstrations, particularly where the numbers were very high?
Well, there were questions about health and safety and so on that sometimes were brought up, but mainly it was the job of these negotiations was to try and find a way to make sure that we were going to where we wanted to go, symbolically very often, whether it was Whitehall or Trafalgar Square or Hyde Park, and that the roads would be closed in sufficient time for us to have to rally and organise people. Those kind of questions.
And what about stewarding? Would the number and the nature of what stewards would do on the day be discussed with the police?
Certainly the numbers of stewards. The police always ask the number of stewards.
And were the police making any particular demands that you do anything or do not do anything in relation to these type of discussions about how the protests or the demonstration would go?
Not really, because they knew very quickly. I mean, they might have done, I can't really remember, it's a long time ago, they might have been nervous at the first, before the first couple of demonstrations, but very quickly they knew that these were peaceful demonstrations involving very often hundreds of thousands of people, and they knew that we had a good stewarding operation, they knew we could pull it off. So they were, with certain exceptions, they were basically routine meetings to kind of just make sure that we were all, that they knew what we were going to do.
And how many meetings were there on average for any one given demonstration?
I'd say on average, probably 2 or 3.
And they would be, over the weeks before the demonstration or a longer period of time?
varied because sometimes our demonstrations were responding to immediate events, but normally we'd have a meeting, say, maybe about a month. The first meeting would be about a month before the demonstration, maybe sometimes a bit longer.
And so how did those meetings generally go? What was the mood of the room?
Normally they were fine. I mean, there was always some tension. I mean, there were debates and arguments about where we would be allowed to demonstrate and where we wouldn't, or where they tried to stop us demonstrating in certain places, which I'm guessing we'll come on to because there were a couple of famous incidents. Actually, the big demonstration on February the 15th, 2003, actually the Home Secretary at the time pressurised the police to say that we couldn't go to Hyde Park. And that caused a very big kind of argument to the point where, again, there was actually a breakdown in the meetings, a failure to agree in the meetings. And we simply had to say we weren't going to accept, we said we weren't going to accept a ban on going to Hyde Park, which, to their credit, the police relented on about a week before the demonstration and kind of, through some process that we weren't quite clear about, managed to overrule the Home Secretary. So we did end up in Hyde Park. But there was, there were a few other times when sort of slightly less dramatic versions of that happened. But I think we got into a good relationship where the police realised, I think this was crucial, the police realised that the level of opposition to the war in Iraq, particularly in Britain, was such that any attempt to tell us that we couldn't march to Parliament or we couldn't march to Downing Street would cause such a kind of furore in society, would cause so much pushback that it wasn't worth their while. They also realised that we were, because of that, able to mobilise hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, and that therefore, really, in the face of that combination, their role had to be one of simply saying, of being relatively kind of cooperative and sensible and simply saying, okay, pointing out if there were real health and safety risks, but in the end of the day, having to basically agree to the proposals that we put to them.
Was the risk or potential for public disorder or violence ever discussed at these meetings?
I don't think so. I mean, maybe it was early on. As I say, they may have been worried before the first couple of demonstrations, but I think they quickly realised that these were peaceful, well-organised, well-stewarded demonstrations whose point was precisely to bring together large numbers of people in a kind of, as I say, in a kind of disciplined demonstration.
Was criminality or breaking the law ever discussed?
I'm sure it was. I'm sure there were times when they felt there were possible risks of that happening, but the actual experience of the demonstrations kind of, presumably after time, allayed their fears of that.
What were the MPS generally saying to you about their position, about how they hoped or planned to police these types of demonstrations? Did they give you details?
Yeah, they normally did. They told, and normally, and I have to say this is less true now than it was then, but normally they said there's going to be a relatively light touch with the policing. Obviously, they will have said we will have people in reserve, but we are going to not have that many officers on the demonstration because, and they said this, our stewarding operations were, adequate and working, and so that kind of satisfied them. That's in general. I'm not saying there weren't instances, particular cases where it would have been different, but that was the general approach.
Was any mention made by either side of potential arrests?
There were, on some of the demonstrations, occasionally one or two arrests, and there were one or two cases where there might have been a few more. But in general,
And it wasn't discussed in these type of meetings specifically?
Well, there wasn't really anything to discuss that I can think of. I mean, there was cases, for example, I remember there was one example where there was worry about some statues being defaced, and they were worried about some of the cenotaph or other statues in Whitehall or vicinity having graffiti on them or things like that, which might have happened. And I remember there was one demonstration where they got some of the statues in Hyde Park covered up. Maybe that was February the 15th, actually, boxed up. So they might have said, and they probably did say, please try and encourage people not to put stickers on statues. But I think in general, that was the level of the discussion about I don't think there was any fear of disorder, really. Certainly not one that was massively expressed by the police.
Was there ever any mention by the police or by anyone of a potential for the police tactic of containment of protesters, or what some people call kettling?
Kettling never happened on our big demonstrations, and the reason is they were too big. I mean, maybe other reasons, but one of the reasons was, I think I'm right in saying that kettling had gone into kind of disrepute to some extent after the May Day events in 2002. So there was probably less kettling going on in general, but kettling is normally a tactic adopted by the police when there's a few hundred people that they don't particularly like. When you've got hundreds of thousands of people, I'd venture to guess that it's not a strategy they can deploy, because that would involve, hundreds of thousands of police. So it wasn't really on the cards when it came to our bigger demonstrations. There were one or two Stop the War events at different times, but this was later, which was smaller, where they did deploy kettling, but it was very rare.
Thank you. You mentioned the demonstration on the 15th of February 2003, and you've described the liaison prior to that demonstration with the Metropolitan Police. I think you were you chief steward on the day for that demonstration? What did that involve on the day in terms of stewarding the demonstration?
Well, it was a headache, because I think we knew probably a few weeks before that it was going to be possibly 1 million people in the streets, which I don't think had ever happened in Britain before. So it was fairly stressful, just in terms of logistics. And we decided, because of the potential size, to have 2 starting points. And then the fact that the government was trying to stop us going to Hyde Park meant that we couldn't, right up until a week before, possibly even less than a week, it meant that we couldn't settle on a plan, so that didn't help. But on the day, it meant having teams of hundreds of stewards at both starting points, making sure that the demonstration at both starting points started at the same time. We actually managed, incredibly, to come together, to kind of merge and meet at Eros in Piccadilly, the two different feeder marches, at exactly the right moment. So it kind of went well. And then we filled Hyde Park, and we filled the sort of eastern section of Hyde Park, which again was something that hadn't happened in our lifetime. So it was a big logistic operation, very big, involving hundreds and hundreds of stewards and all sorts of moving parts, and 2 stages. One stage, but a whole number of screens and PA systems throughout Hyde Park. So it was a big operation.
You say at paragraph 2.11, page 4 of your statement, that the demonstration passed off extremely peacefully, and in fact the police reported fewer arrests in central London that day than on a typical Saturday. Is that right?
Yeah.
Where did you get your information about the arrest figures?
From the police.
Do you know how many protesters were arrested on that day? Were protesters arrested on that day or not?
I've got a feeling, and I might be wrong, but I've got a feeling the figure was 12.
Did you witness any criminality, disorder or violence during that demonstration?
No.
No, thank you. Can we look, please, at MPS 0018136? It's at tab 60, B63 of the bundle, please. It's a report dated the 24th of March 2003. And I think it must be over the page. And I don't know how long this and again, please. There we go, page 3. So this is a report on globalised resistance and stop the war activity. And it says, the current perception amongst activists preparing to resist the war, as at midnight Tuesday, the 18th of March 2003, is that uniformed police serials have been instructed to treat protesters in a very softly fashion. And many seasoned activists with groups such as the Socialist Workers' Party and Globalised Resistance believe that the opportunity exists to get away with significantly more militant behaviour than normally would be the case. And further down, it says Nineham had clearly been surprised when police failed to move in on the sit-down protesters, even when they began unlinking and knocking over the crowd barriers that had been deployed. He thinks that the police have been reined in and that globalised activists should seek to exploit any and every flashpoint on the streets. I'd just like your comment on the accuracy of that report, and in particular, whether you did consider it to be that type of opportunity, and whether GR activists were seeking to exploit every flashpoint on the streets.
I mean, I think this is part and parcel of almost everything that Simon Wellings says. He seems to be absolutely obsessed with the idea that the aim of various groups involved was to, disrupt, create disorder and so on and so forth, which really wasn't part of the strategy of Stop the War at all. I mean, he's talking about his sense of what is really spiky is sitting down in the road, which I'm sure has happened at different, particularly at the static protests. I think there are a number of examples where people sat down in the road. But I mean, it's not exactly the most subversive activity. It's always been part of a peace movement protest. And he's trying to paint it as ever as being something sinister. It's not something sinister. It's an attempt to effectively underline and increase the impact of protest.
What was the Stop the War coalition's and your view on non-violent direct action and direct action? Are the two different, or are they the same? Are they interchangeable phrases?
I think the most important thing to say is that the central spine of the strategy of the Stop the War coalition was the big demonstrations and the mobilising on the widest possible scale in order to create a movement that was so powerful that it simply couldn't be resisted by the government, if you know what I mean. It couldn't be ignored, that it put maximum political pressure. And our view was always and remains that we want people from every community, we want people from every workplace, we want people from every university, town and city to come together as an expression of collective will on this matter. And our view on direct action is shaped by that overall strategic purpose. And there are times when people feel so strongly that they want to go beyond or do something slightly different from the mass protest. But by the way, one argument that we always put is that these mass demonstrations were in themselves a form of non-violent direct action, in the sense that they stopped the centre of London for hours and hours and hours in a way that was, involved very participatory but also very impactful. Non-violent direct action was something that, happened in terms of sit-downs in the street, in terms of various kind of symbolic actions outside various meetings and gatherings, sometimes outside Parliament. These are things, they're part and parcel of every kind of protest movement, inevitably. We supported them. Sometimes the Stop the War Coalition would have been involved in helping to organise them, not as a central strand of what we did, but as an element of it. But never, nothing that, I mean, certainly Stop the War wasn't involved in anything that involved any kind of violence to property or person.
Can I just ask you about one report before we come to the George Bush November demonstration, which I do want to ask you about. But can we look first, please, at MPS 0029217, and it's at tab B79 of the bundle. This is a report dated the 3rd of October 2003, and it's the report at the bottom entitled Globalised Resistance Oil Day. It says there, the Stop the War Coalition and other groups, including Globalised Resistance, have called a day of action, Oil Day, on Tuesday the 21st of October 2003. This will be to protest against the perceived beneficiaries of the Iraq conflict, the big oil companies. And then over onto page 2, Chris Nineham, a leading light within both the Stop the War Coalition and Globalised Resistance, has suggested that demonstrators and activists should be encouraged to vent their frustrations against the most visible elements of the oil companies in the UK, petrol station forecourts. Do you recall this?
No.
Did you?
I mean, I'm not saying that the oil day didn't happen, but I definitely don't, the station forecourts thing.
So you didn't encourage activists to vent their frustrations against...
Not only I didn't, but I wouldn't, because that would have led to potentially to sort of clashes with people working in garages, which wouldn't have seemed particularly sensible.
No, and potential for public disorder.
Absolutely,
would you accept?
Yeah.
So this wouldn't have been the type of thing that you would have done.
That's made up.
So this is, you would say, just fabricated by Simon Wellings. Sarah, I'm conscious of the time. I'm coming to a sort of a big topic on the November 2003 demonstration. I'm happy to start it, or I'm happy to break now for the afternoon break a little early. I'm in your hands.
Would you prefer to stop now? Of course, yes. We'll break now for 10 minutes. Yes.
Thank you, sir.
10 minutes.
So, Mr. Nineham, I want to ask you about the George Bush demonstration in November 2003. Can we look at, please, MPS 0029481 at tab B84? And this is a report dated the 24th of October 2003. And in this report, it suggested that Lindsay German, John Rees, you, along with Professor Alex Kalinikos, were hoping that serious disorder would break out at this protest. And the report continued, this week's issue of the Socialist Worker will carry a lead article by Kalinikos arguing that one of the two most effective forms of direct action is riot. And I'd like to just get your reaction, please, to those elements of the report. Are they accurate?
Not at all. And in one sort of indication of how inaccurate they are is that the actual article that Wellings refers to argues pretty much the opposite of what he says it argues. In other words, that rioting is not part of the strategy of the kind of choice of strategy of socialists. And I just want to sort of give a little bit of context here, because if there had been any rioting or serious disorder on that day, you have to think, would that have been, I mean, if we want to get into it, which I don't particularly, but seeing as he raised it, would that have been good for the movement? Would it have been problematic? Actually, it would have been very problematic for the movement, because what it would have meant was no doubt lots of arrests. It would have meant images in the papers and in the media of disorder on the streets, and it would have actually reduced our capacity to mobilise. For us, as I said, I've already mentioned, the most important thing was to represent and mobilise the absolutely massive anti-war sentiment that had developed in Britain at this time. And in a way, part of our inspiration, maybe not totally consciously, but was the experience of the anti-Vietnam War movement in the United States in the 60s and 70s, where any sort of serious look at that history tells you that it was precisely the fact that the movement managed to mobilise on such an epic scale that anti-war sentiment and organisation permeated into every aspect of American society, to the point where it was no longer possible for the authorities to continue to conduct that war. That was the impact of those huge demonstrations back at that time, and that was the impact that we were hoping for here, to have demonstrations. And this demonstration turned out to be 300,000 strong, the biggest demonstration on a weekday on any subject in British history.
Yes, thank you. I'm
okay, sorry.
Tight for time, so I'd just like to address some of the nature of what's in the report. Were you hoping that serious disorder would break out?
Absolutely not.
Was direct action planned in terms of a sit-down protest or any other form of direct action that was within the sort of philosophy and intentions of the organisation of this demonstration?
No, not at all. It would have been impossible.
If we look then at the next report, which is MPS 0029562, please, at tab B85. This is dated the 30th of October 2003, so it's about a week later. And this report says John Rees, Chris Nineham and Lindsay German, all coalition steering committee members and of course central committee members of the SWP, are all still talking in terms of creating the kind of demonstration on the 20th that will end in a way that encourages mass civil disobedience and direct action. Their vision is that tens of thousands of fired up activists will end up in Trafalgar Square, witness the ritual pulling down of a Bush statue that will be attacked and beaten with shoes and then bomb burst, but I think burst out of the square to different locations to stage mass sit-downs at important road junctions and carry out other direct actions such as attacks on visibly American offices, buildings and monuments. And then it says, it is important to realise that much of their planning has the aim of creating the correct kind of atmosphere for this to be possible, rather than have a team of leaders on the streets attempting to marshal organised teams of activists. And then just towards the end, it says he believes, that's you, referring to you, that the tension will be racked up by the inevitably high police presence on the street and the physical restraints that are likely to be put in place at key locations, such as Buckingham Palace. He opined that one tiny flashpoint will kick the whole thing off and then we'll be in business. What's your reaction to the accuracy of that report, and in particular the type of language used in it to describe what was planned for this demonstration?
Well, it's a sort of intensification of the already existing theme of Simon Wellings constantly trying to say that we were looking to do this kind of thing, which we weren't. And
so the intention, you would say, was an entirely peaceful protest, is that right?
It is, and that's what happened, which is kind of proves the point, really.
And you were centrally involved in organising this protest and were chief steward on the day, I think. Very briefly, what did chief steward on the day of this demonstration involve? Making
sure that the demonstration started, was safe and went from point A through the centre of London, down Whitehall, to Trafalgar Square, and effectively and safely. And I do want to point out one thing, which is that the real sort of flashpoint, insofar as there was one, happened actually in the weeks before the demonstration, when once again the police tried to stop us, as they said, under pressure from the CIA, tried to stop us from marching down Whitehall, because apparently the CIA had said that George Bush was going to be in Downing Street and didn't want to be confronted by huge numbers of people demonstrating down Whitehall. That was the political issue around this demonstration. That was the political battle which was had out in public in the days and weeks before. And once again, the police, because they understood, and one thing we said to them actually was, look, if you do this, then there really is the possibility of some level of disorder. If you ban a peaceful, organised demonstration through the streets of central London on this issue because you've been told to by the CIA, then you are taking things into another realm. They relented once again. The demonstration was allowed down Whitehall, it went to Trafalgar Square, and it passed off peacefully.
Thank you. Just in terms of the policing of the demonstration, was there any discussion previously, as this report tends to suggest amongst the activists, of deliberately confronting the police during the protest?
Absolutely none.
Was that ever part of Stop the War coalition's strategy or tactics, the deliberate confrontation with police?
No.
You've just described what happened during the demonstration, and you say that it passed off peacefully, and in your witness statement, paragraph 2.14, you say impactfully. Is that right?
Yeah, as I say, the victory for us was that despite police attempts to stop the demonstration taking place, central London was completely brought to a standstill by 300,000 people on a weekday. That was the political victory, which was something we had to fight for, but we fought for it politically in the pages of the newspapers, TV, and so on and so forth in the run-up to the demonstration. So we regarded it as a very big success.
And did you witness any disorder or violence?
No.
The part of the report talks about a ritual pulling down of a Bush statue that will be attacked and beaten. And also talks about direct actions such as attacks on visibly American offices, buildings and monuments. Was that ever part of the intention for this demonstration?
That was apparently a fantasy on the part of Simon Wellings. There was a statue which was a paper mache statue that we erected with agreement with the GLA on the steps on the stage, and we pulled it down in a symbolic gesture that actually made the front page of most of the papers. So that was a success, obviously mimicking the what the Americans had done to a statue of Saddam Hussein. But again, this was a symbolic act. There was no smashing up of the statue afterwards. It was a ritual kind of pulling down of the statue to make a political point, and it was a political point well made.
And there weren't any such attacks on visibly American offices, buildings or monuments, so far as you were aware?
One thing I would say is that there was a noticeably tenser atmosphere with the police, not just in the run-up, as I say, around the CIA pressure, but also on the day itself. I very much remember the feeling that the police were very jumpy, that they were there was more police in riot gear than normal. I was getting phone calls like every 30 seconds pretty much from the Gold Commander on the day saying, is everything all right? You know, they were definitely monitoring me much more closely. I wonder whether that was partly Simon Welling's fault.
Because of the nature of this, you say, essentially exaggerated and sensationalist type of reporting prior to the demonstration.
Yeah, I wouldn't even say exaggerated. I'd just say it's fantastic.
Thank you. I want to look at one last report on this demonstration. It's dated the 15th of July 2004, and it's page 3 of MPS 0035842 at tab B108 of the bundle, please. This report concerns the planning of the London European Social Forum, which you were involved in organising. But before we come to that event, it does contain a passage about how the George Bush demonstration went and was planned. And it's the last paragraph starting this situation. And it says, this situation has existed before when US President George Bush visited London. In that case, Nineham, who had put Taylor on standby to kick things off with the police in Trafalgar Square, eventually reined Taylor in rather than let him off the leash. This was as a direct result of pressure coming from key activists in the Muslim Association of Britain, MAB, who wanted no part of a riot. Nineham knew that it was vital at that time to keep them within the Stop the War coalition, and so settled for a protest that, although huge, inevitably made less of an impact than, say, the poll tax demonstration. And that paragraph, the situation that had existed before, was the desire, supposedly professed by you and Mr. Taylor, to mount real and effective direct action. In relation to that section, then, what do you say about the accuracy generally of that paragraph of the report?
I'd say it's a fabrication.
Did you have the ability to rein Mr. Taylor in, or indeed let him off the leash?
Or more relevantly, did Taylor have the ability to unleash, to kick things off with the police in Trafalgar Square? I doubt it, with all respect to him. But anyway, it wasn't part of what we were aiming to do. And as I said to you before, it's not that we as an organisation were against direct action or non-violent direct action. And in fact, on the days before the Iraq war actually started in March 2003, there were walkouts from schools and actually some workplaces which were kind of participatory, democratic actions that were taken involving thousands of people that had a huge impact. That kind of direct action which moved from having demonstrations to actually people walking out of work and stopping what they were doing in order to protest against a war that was illegal, that was something that we were happy to support and was part of the general approach. But small groups of people attacking American offices or whatever is just nothing to do with anything that we ever stood for.
So essentially your view is that this is Simon Wellings having predicted a riot in previous reporting, or at least a degree of public disorder and violence, having to explain untruthfully in a report after the fact why it didn't happen.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Yeah, that is what I think.
Can we just look at the section before this paragraph, please, of this report? It's paragraph 4 onwards, starting to that end. He, and that's referring to you, is pushing for the event, and this is the European Social Forum, to culminate in a large demonstration that will end in Trafalgar Square with a concert and party. Nineham also realises the significance of the event to next year's G8 protests. He knows that the ESF could potentially draw in and radicalise a whole swathe of individuals who currently sit in the NGO trade unionist camp and energise them into building their own protests at the event. Perhaps most significantly, Nineham has already warned his close friend and fellow activist, Guy Taylor, that he must be ready to mount real and effective direct action in both the lead up to the ESF and, of course, at the G8 that will follow some 6 months later. This course of action will always be determined by political expediency. Nineham would only order it done if it was necessary, for instance, if very radical young activists were being attracted elsewhere to get their kicks, or if the resultant publicity was desperately needed. Were you advocating or planning for real and effective direct action in both the lead up to the ESF and the G8?
I mean, again, the language, political expediency, get their kicks and so on and so forth, it tells you a story about an attempt to sort of demonise the movement.
So it was
There's nothing
Wellings...
wrong, to answer your question directly, I mean, there was direct action associated with the European Social Forum. Not massive, but there were various different sit-down protests that took place. As I remember, there was a plan that only half took place for there to be a protest outside some companies in Canary Wharf that were refusing trade union rights for some of the cleaners in that area, for example. But these were forms of non-violent direct action that were well within the law and had nothing to do with any kind of violent disorder.
Whereas you would say that here what he's trying to do is imply violence.
I assume so, or imply in some way that what we were promoting was illegal, but he doesn't actually say it. I guess because he couldn't really harvest any real evidence.
Thank you. You've made very clear in your evidence that each of the groups you've been involved in and been involved in leading, the SWP, Globalised Resistance and Stop the War Coalition, did not advocate or intend there to be public disorder, criminality or violence as part of their strategy or policy. But I just want to ask you whether there was any formal or agreed internal policy on public disorder or violence within any of those three organisations.
I mean, no, because it wasn't something that was discussed or entertained as being part of a strategy. As I say, there were times when we engaged in non-violent civil disobedience, non-violent protest, direct action, but never with a view to there being a disorder or violence of any kind.
And it wasn't used as a strategy or tactic.
No.
In terms of peaceful protest, you say at paragraph 4.1, page 14 of your witness statement, that the protests you've been involved in, have organised and have been chief steward of, were designed with the express intention of being peaceful. What did that mean in practice in terms of what you did to ensure that that was the case?
Well, I mean, anything that we promoted or planned would have always been of a peaceful nature. I mean, it's not a question that even really came up. I mean, the only time in my experience of demonstrations and protests in the anti-war movement and beyond, when there has been any form of disorder, it's normally been actually after the protests that we've organised have finished, and normally been as a response to what I would have called heavy-handed policing. And that's a kind of responsive, thing. It's never been part of the actual planning or promotion of the kind of events that we've been involved in.
And I'll come to police response in a moment, but just sticking with this, how was the message that these movements, these demonstrations, these protests were to be peaceful, conveyed internally within the three groups that you were involved in?
Well, particularly in the stewarding, which is the front end, the sort of interface with the wider movement, what we always say to the stewards is, look, there may be people who want to provoke trouble, opponents, or even potentially people from the police force who want there to be some incidents taking place. Our view is that if that happens, it will be used against the movement, and it will actually stop our ability. If that were to happen, it would restrict and reduce our ability to mobilise the kind of numbers and the social forces and the social weight that we're looking to do. So that is something that we explicitly say at the stewards' meetings. Diffuse anything, dissuade people on our side from anything that could lead to incidents could lead to a situation where on the front page of the paper the next day what we see is fighting in Whitehall. That will not help us because we're trying to build a mass participatory movement.
That's amongst the stewarding group that, of course, you were chief steward of. What about amongst the more general membership, or indeed the public messaging?
It doesn't come up in terms of public messaging because it's not something, as I say, it's not something we particularly, it's not seen as being actual clashes with the police or violence of any kind is not something that's associated with our movement. Internally, if it ever came up, we'd give the same answer as we give to the stewards, who are, after all, the people who actually have to deal with the reality of that potential situation.
Do you think it was discussed internally more widely than the stewards within any of those groups?
Sorry, do I think what was discussed?
The message that these protests and demonstrations were to be expressly peaceful.
Yeah, I think that would definitely have been a discussion, because people would have raised the possibility of different kinds of strategies and options. So definitely that would be something that pretty much everyone was aware of.
And was that message conveyed expressly to the MPS during, for example, your liaison with them in advance of demonstrations?
If asked, it would have been. But I think they would have also understood it from the experience of the demonstrations.
Thank you. Were there specific measures put in place to ensure that demonstrations were peaceful, either in advance or on the day, other than the stewarding that you've described?
I mean, in a way, not particularly, because everyone knew what was happening here. They knew it was a mass demonstration. They knew it was a family event. They knew they could bring, people from who weren't necessarily involved on the left. They knew what kind of demonstrations these were. So, the stewarding in a way is fairly critical here. Obviously, if there was anyone in the movement who had a different view, then we'd talk to them and discuss it out. But, the message on the day was always avoid being provoked.
And so the stewarding structure and the number of stewards you would say were some of the specific measures that were put in place to minimise the risk of public disorder or violence. Because
the stewards, it's not just how they intervene, it's also when you have hundreds of stewards, it kind of has the stewarding group has the effect of kind of permeating through the movement to a certain extent, of kind of passing on a message through the movement.
Was there any contingency planning to address possible breakaway or confrontational actions? So, for example, by smaller groups of people with different intentions to yours and Stop the War coalitions or globalised resistance. In other words, those a minority intent on causing public disorder or violence.
Dissuasion, really, which you in the end of the day, other political groups, have the right to do what they want to do, and there's not a great deal that you can do. When they're part of our demonstrations, we try and, through discussion with them in advance, sometimes on the day, through the stewarding process, through the general spirit of the demonstration, we try and say to them, on this day, please stick to the general approach that we have, which is to have the maximum turnout, the maximum impact. And normally they get carried along. And by and large, I would say during most of the Iraq demonstrations, certainly the big demonstrations, there weren't really any breakouts. Sometimes people did some other things afterwards, but in general, people stuck to the point, to the purpose, to the strategy.
And was that sort of discussion and contingency planning, a risk of breakaway groups, ever discussed with the MPS before these demonstrations or not?
No, probably not. Mainly because it didn't arise.
At paragraph 4.2, page 14 of your statement, you say that a very small number of demonstrations I've been on have witnessed low levels of disorder. I've been chief steward on over 50 national demonstrations, and the only instances of anything approaching disorder on these occasions have happened after the end of the protests, and in all cases I can remember as a result of provocative and sometimes aggressive policing. What do you mean there by low levels of disorder?
On one or two demonstrations, there have been some clashes with the police. As I say, in the evening after our demonstration is over, as people stay behind, as some small numbers of people stay behind, and sometimes the police move in very, very quickly to try and clear them off the streets. They are obviously staying behind because they still feel frustrated and angry at the issue, at the war, at the attacks on the Palestinians, whatever. And sometimes there is heavy-handed policing, which is something that we feed back to the police when that happens, and we do complain about. And I would say that, I'm talking about 2 or 3 instances, maybe 3 or 4 instances in 25 years of organising demonstrations where this has happened. And yeah, it's something that we very strongly would put down to a level of sort of, police overreaction.
At paragraph 106, page 39 of Simon Welling's statement, MPS 0748847, he states in relation to globalised resistance, given the disorder in Seattle and Genoa caused by anti-capitalist protesters, and in London on the 18th of June 1999, and at May Day protests at the turn of the century, the potential for public disorder was clear. Do you agree or disagree with that?
The levels of public disorder on the demonstrations in London, the May Day demonstrations, which were demonstrations that I wasn't involved in, were very, very low level and were very, very easily contained. In Genoa, which is a reference to the anti-G8 protest which took place there in 2001, there was some disorder, but once again, it was, famously caused by the police assassination of one of the protesters. And that's a case in point that actually, to talk about the disorder as if it was caused by the globalisation movement is palpably unhistorical and untrue. And actually, the demonstration that took place after the assassination, the police assassination of Carlo Giuliani, at that demonstration, at that series of events, the demonstration that took place the following day was completely peaceful.
Thank you. Could we look at MPS 0027912, it's at tab B75 of the bundle? This is a report in relation to the visit of Ariel Sharon on the 14th of July 2003. And I just want to ask you about one element of it, which is that this was the demonstration where Mr. Taylor was arrested, attempting to lead a dash into Whitehall to carry out a sit-down protest, and there were 3 other arrests, I think, made on the day. And it says this towards the bottom of page 1. It is important to note that prior to the disorder, globalised resistance activists had been busily passing through the crowd in both an attempt to both stir up the crowd and up the ante and gauge people's willingness to mount some form of direct action. Instrumental in this endeavour were Taylor himself, Chris Nineham, and then a number of other names, including some with privacy redactions. These individuals were also centrally involved once the disorder broke out, in particular whipping up the crowd in the attempt to de-arrest and trap the police officers carrying out the initial arrest. I think you were present at this demonstration. Was there the public disorder described here? Did that happen so far as you recall?
I mean, my memory of this day, I have to say, is very a bit indistinct. But what he's saying is, in reality, if you strip away the rhetoric and the kind of flowery language, is that some people from globalised resistance were trying to organise direct action. Now, direct action is not illegal in this country. You're talking about a sit-down in a road as a response to an invitation to a highly controversial political figure. That's not illegal, and it certainly doesn't involve disorder. It involves sitting down in a road. So, again, massive hyperbole.
Were you involved in the way that this sets out?
That I can't. I honestly don't remember. But I wouldn't completely rule it out that I may have advocated that people should sit in a road in order to protest against someone widely regarded as a kind of butcher of the Palestinian people. So, yes, that's possible.
Was Simon Wellings present, as is set out here?
I'm imagining, but I couldn't
Do you
be
recall?
No, I can't say for certain.
Can you recall in any detail how he behaved or if he was involved in this action?
What I can recall from the period in the run-up to this protest was that Simon, and actually after, and in the run-up to the protest against the visit of Kissinger to London, was that Simon Wellings was at the forefront of those people within. In fact, he was probably an outlier, in the sense that he was someone who was constantly trying to advocate more edgy tactics when it came to protest. As I say, when I say edgy, we're talking about sit-downs in the road, so we're not talking about criminality, we're not talking about violence, we're not really talking about disorder, but nevertheless, Simon Wellings was definitely someone who was, in fact, there was a kind of joke within globalised resistance that Simon was the one who was always pushing for maximum, confrontation may be too strong a word, but definitely for more, non-violent disobedience and sitting down, and possibly once or twice he might have even pushed for us to push up against police lines and so on. I think he was definitely known for that.
Was he engaged in the sort of behaviour that he reported here, that the sort of attempting to stir up the crowd, up the ante, and gauge people's willingness to mount some form of direct action?
As I say, I cannot tell you for sure.
Do you recall if he was there when Guy Taylor was arrested?
I can't say for certain. I'm assuming from the document that he is, but I don't know.
Thank you. We've discussed public disorder and violence at some length. In terms of the philosophy on criminality or law breaking, what was the position or the policy or philosophy of the three organisations you were involved in on breaking the law or criminality? Was there any difference between that in terms of, or as between public disorder and violence and criminality, or was it the same sort of philosophy?
Broadly speaking, I'd say it was the same. I would say that, none of the organisations, certainly not Stop the War Coalition, and even Globalised Resistance, the SWP, were promoted anything that was involved disorder, or involved, criminality of any kind, really.
Was there any in any of those groups formal or agreed internal policy on breaking the law? Or any informal one?
I don't think any of those groups kind of had that sort of, worked out sort of programmatic statements, or they're more. The strategic approach was something that was more evolved in practice. I would say that that doesn't mean that I or the others in the organisations believed that there were no circumstances in which breaking the law was justified. I think if you look back over the history of direct action and civil disobedience, there are times, quite important moments, the suffragettes, the anti-apartheid movement, the civil rights movement in the US, where when wrongs are so egregious that and they're so kind of backed up by the institutions of the law, there are times when I think historically looking back you can say that breaking the law in certain specific circumstances was justified. So it's not to say that in all these cases there's an absolutely blanket view that you can't break the law, but certainly there's no sense in which that was central to the strategy or the tactics that were adopted by any of these organisations.
Do you accept that in some forms of direct action there would be a risk of criminality or law breaking?
Yeah.
And do you accept that that sort of potential or risk may legitimately have an effect on the way in which the police would plan to or carry out policing of demonstrations or other public events?
Yeah, I can see it would be taken into consideration. Having said that, the two things really. A, civil disobedience and direct action of the sort that we're talking about was not something that was central to any of the organisations, that was a central part of the strategy of any of the organisations, as I've explained. B, the kind of civil disobedience that at times was used, even if not centrally, was not the kind that leads directly to criminality or to violence or damage to property. None of these organisations saw that as being something that we would want to pursue. And as I say, with the mass organisations in particular, anything that does lead in that direction actually tends to militate against the kind of movement that we're trying to build.
I want to look, please, at MPS 0008906 at tab B36, please. You deal with this report at paragraph 5.7, page 22 of your witness statement, and it's about a Palestine workshop. And I just want to ask you about a passage in the middle of the page, which says the overall message of the workshop was that violence was the only solution to the current crisis faced by the Palestinian people, and that to consider any other approach was a futile and gigantic waste of time and effort. You say that there are several serious problems with this document in your statement, paragraphs 5.7 to 5.15, and that it conflates strategies for those Palestinians living in Gaza and the West Bank to those protesting the war in the UK, and you don't accept that the overall message of the workshop was violence, is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's unthinkable that could have been the case, because that was just simply not part of the sort of politics and approach that globalised resistance was known for.
So again, what do you think that Simon Wellings was trying to achieve with this report?
Well, I mean, I can't, fortunately, get myself into Simon Wellings' mind or psychology, but I'm guessing that, again, he was trying to justify his role and the continuation of his role by playing up and exaggerating or misconstruing entirely the views and approach of globalised resistance. But I also do think that this is perhaps one of the features or one of the functions of of what Simon Wellings did is to help to generate this sort of demonisation and this wrongful characterisation of the movements, to try and exaggerate the level to which they're involved in confrontation, to try and say they're violent when they're not violent, to try and say they want to adopt tactics and strategies that actually they don't, as a way of criminalising and demonising and trying to marginalise the movements.
Can I just ask you briefly about the May Day protests? And I think that globalised resistance did have some involvement in the May Day protests in the years 2002 to 2004, is that right?
Yeah.
There's a document, MPS 0008385 at tab B14 of the bundle, that's dated the 25th of March 2002, which concerns an open planning meeting for the Globalised Resistance May Day Committee. And it sets out that Privacy, a steering committee member, and you chaired the meeting. And then I just want to look at the paragraph just above the source comment, which says Nineham opened his address with the somewhat controversial gambit that rioting works. Did you say something along those lines at this meeting in 2002?
I have absolutely no idea. I doubt it. I suspect that if I did, it was probably a bit of a joke, because I think what I might have been referring to was the fact that what happened in the following May Day, the May Day demonstration immediately after this meeting that we were planning was, or what had just happened was that the authorities had actually agreed for the first time since the kind of more controversial kettled protests that we could have a May Day demonstration during the week on May Day itself that was allowed. So in that sense, I may have meant, okay, what happened at the previous ones has made the police think again and actually allow something that is now legitimate. So if I said that, which I'm really not sure if I did, that is what I would have meant, and it's important.
You weren't proposing a riot at these...
The exact opposite. What I was saying is, isn't it good that the police have been forced to back off and allow there to be what turned out to be a massive, peaceful May Day anti-capitalist protest that year?
Can we look at one more report about May Day, please, this time from 2004, MPS 0034504 at tab B99. And this report on May Day, the one at the bottom, says Chris Nineham is keen to spice things up a bit in the immediate run-up to the annual May Day march this year. It goes into the reasons. He's keen to live up to the reputation that globalised resistance brings to the annual Workers' March, that of being a radical activist organisation rather than one that simply marches from A to B. And it will satisfy those grassroots activists that are keen to engage in a little direct action. He has suggested a picket and occupation of either the flagship Nike Town store or one of the big Gap clothes shops on Oxford Street in the hours before the march assembles. How accurate is this report? Were you keen to spice things up a bit, and what do you understand that to mean here?
To be honest with you, I can't remember whether this is true or not, and given that Wellings has a certain ability to twist the truth, I wouldn't like to say. However, even if it is true, it's not exactly a suggestion of criminality on our part. What he claims I was suggesting was a picket and possible occupation of a store on Oxford Street before the march assembles. Again, this is non-violent direct action that may or may not have been being proposed. This is civil disobedience. This is well within the law, and is certainly not proposing any kind of violence or really disorder. or damage to property for that matter.
Thank you. I want to ask you very briefly about subversion. Do you consider that the aims and objectives of any of the three groups that you were involved in or led involved subversive action?
No.
Or intention?
No.
In this context, what do you understand subversion to mean?
Well, I suppose it can mean quite a lot of things, but in general terms, I guess it means the kind of some sort of secretive plan to infiltrate institutions or topple the state by small numbers of people, or some such kind of political strategy.
And none of the groups that you were involved in would have had that as an aim or objective. You gave some evidence earlier about particularly the SWP being a democratic organisation. Were the other two also pro-democracy and democratic organisations?
Yeah, democratic organisations that recognise, and particularly in the case of the SWP, recognise the limitations, actually, of democracy as it exists currently, and recognise and believe that democracy should be massively expanded, and that one of the problems of the society we live in is that ordinary people have too little control over the world and over their own lives, and that really what a socialist and a Marxist approach here is to say we need much more democracy, not less. And actually, sorry to go on, but just to say that the real threat to democracy at the moment, it seems to me, comes from, again, corporate power, but also various forms of authoritarianism, and that the tradition of the left is to say we defend democracy against those threats, but also seek to extend it.
Thank you. In relation to the Steering Committee of Globalised Resistance, you say at paragraph 7.3, page 31 of your statement, that Simon Wellings was elected to your steering committee. And you say that this is significant as it demonstrates how deeply embedded he became within the organisation. And it also aligns with a broader and more troubling pattern where the SDS managers appeared to encourage or even facilitate UCOs assuming leadership or influential roles within activist groups. We know, we don't need to bring it up, but from MPS 00188972 tab B67, that he was elected to the steering committee at the 2003 annual conference. What he says about this at paragraph 112 at page 41 of his witness statement, MPS 0748847, is that my election to the steering committee of GR that is referred to in my raw report, apparently dated the 12th of May 2003, was wholly unremarkable in many respects. Many of the activists were surprised that I was not already a member when this fact became apparent at the steering committee meeting that preceded the annual conference. As is clear from the final page of the report, the election was a rubber stamp exercise, and even individuals who were not present were unanimously elected by the conference. Do you have... he also goes on to say in paragraph 113 at pages 41 to 42 that given the size of the GR steering committee and the fact that Guy Taylor and Chris Nineham were taking their orders from the SWP Central Committee in any event, I had no influence on proceedings. Do you have any comment about those two statements by Simon Wellings?
I mean, not really. It's just, he calls it a rubber stamping, I call it an election. I mean, and it obviously did mean that he was seeking to be influential within the very fact that he put himself forward shows he was seeking to play an active role in the leadership. I think I've dealt with the taking orders from the SWP steering, Central Committee. I mean, I was on the Central Committee, so I couldn't really take orders from it. We had debates about, as I said before, what to do within the organisation, and we did our best to carry them out.
Would he, as part of the steering committee, had an opportunity to influence policy and strategy?
Yes.
I think you say at paragraph 10.3 that the steering committee, of your statement, that the steering committee was crucial in directing Global Resistance's work, and also that it decided our campaigning priorities, discussed what we should prioritise and reflected on the broader political situation. So was he influential in those ways on the steering committee?
I think he was trying to be, and as I say, he was someone who pursued quite single-mindedly, appeared to be pursuing a particular or arguing for a particular type of approach, which was more direct action-y and so on. So I think he was trying to be. Whether he had that much influence in reality is another question, because I think I don't think he was a particularly eloquent sort of, operator. I don't think he had. I mean, I always found him a bit of an odd character, I have to say, because I didn't think he had very much politics, and obviously now I know why. So I'm not sure that he was really that influential, but he was obviously trying to be. That's why he stood for the steering committee, and also he was someone who hung around the office loads. I mean, he tried to make himself indispensable by coming into the office and volunteering. I'd say probably possibly more than almost anyone else. He was in the office, he was working, he was wanting to be there.
Thank you. I just want to deal with one particular point that you raise in your witness statement that you're concerned about. There is a report, MPS 0032025 at tab B97, and this attaches, it's a report by Simon Wellings to his office, and it attaches the Globalised Resistance membership list, and it includes a password, and you say in your statement that paragraph 7.5 to 7.6 at page 32 that you're very concerned about the contents of this report and the fact that the membership list was passed by Mr. Wellings to the police. You go on to say at paragraph 7.6, page 33, that even more disturbing than attaching the membership list is the implication suggested by this report that Simon Wellings unlawfully took items belonging to Globalised Resistance. You say this UCO not only violated internal confidentiality but committed theft in the service of political policing, and that's an abuse of power. What are you referring to when you talk about him committing theft there?
Well, I mean, I think, to be honest with you, I think the whole question of taking the membership list is absolutely shocking. We've discussed the kind of organisation that Globalised Resistance was, but for an undercover police officer to be taking away membership lists of organisations has really serious implications, which, could include the blacklisting or the potential.
So it's about data.
It's about data more than anything, yeah.
Thank you. There are a number of reports on you and other members of Globalised Resistance that report private personal information that you think was unnecessary. I don't need to go to all of them, but for your reference, MPS 0036507 at tab B112 and MPS 0008521 at tab B20. And then this one, please, MPS 0008805 at tab 30, which reports your new mobile number and how you came to be offered an upgrade and what your handset was like. Do you have any further comment on that report?
Apart from a sense of kind of anger and outrage, really, that police time and resources should be spent on presumably bugging my phone or at least trying to find ways to intercept my messages is an outrageous infringement of my civil liberties as an individual and a political organiser. So only that.
You detail at paragraph 7.11 at pages 35 and 36 of your statement a number of different reports that contain personal information such as addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, places of work, and other personal details of private lives of activists. And you also comment that there are reports on social events, for example, at MPS 00083990 at tab B17 and MPS 0009843 at tab B41 of the bundle. And I just want to get your general views now about the level of intrusion into the private lives of you and other activists by Simon Wellings.
Well, that in itself is, all of these examples are in themselves shocking, and they are, as you say, a breach of privacy, a gross breach of privacy. But in a way, what is even worse is to think about why this information was being extracted. And one of the things about the tape message that eventually uncovered Simon Wellings is that he was in the process of talking to presumably his handler, his manager, about personal relationships, not political things entirely, but personal relationships between different members of globalised resistance. Presumably, one can only assume this is information that is being considered to be used as a way of, I don't know, as a way of disrupting the organisation or kind of causing, deliberate disorganisation, potential tensions and so on and so forth. I can't see what other possible reason there would be to pass this information on. So this is an insight into the real role that is being played by Simon Wellings here, in my opinion. It's not just about information gathering, it's not about criminality, it's about finding ways to undermine a legitimate, legal, political organisation.
Thank you. That could be taken down now, please. You mentioned the discovery that Simon Wellings was an undercover police officer, and the inquiry is very familiar with how that came about and has heard evidence about it. But just dealing briefly with your discovery of it and reaction to it, you discovered that he was an undercover police officer when the member of Globalised Resistance who he had accidentally called and then recorded on the answer phone him reporting to the SDS information on Globalised Resistance members, and that person brought the tape into the office, is that right?
Yeah.
And you listened to the tape a number of times, I think, with other Globalised Resistance members, is that right?
Yeah.
Did you immediately recognise it to be Simon Wellings as that person on the tape?
We weren't sure for quite a long time. I must have listened to it 30 or 40 times myself, and I think others even more, because it was quite indistinct.
And how did you come to then accept that it was indeed him and that he was an undercover police officer?
Really just because we listened to it so many times and kind of narrowed it down. And I mean, even when he was confronted, and I wasn't there when he was confronted, I guess there was an element of doubt in people's minds, but we felt we had enough. It was kind of clear enough to at least confront him with the information and see how he reacted. We felt we didn't have a choice, because clearly it was someone, and it was someone close to the heart of Globalised Resistance, so it had to be dealt with, and we decided on a balance of probability it was him.
And when you'd come to accept that, what was your reaction? How did you feel about it?
I was really shocked. I mean, given the kind of organisation that Globalised Resistance was, I wouldn't say I'm naive about the role that the police play in society, but nevertheless, I was amazed that resources would be spent on, and time and energy would be spent on getting into this organisation, whose every move was completely public, that was an open, democratic organisation with big, open public meetings and so on and so forth, that planned no illegality, no criminality. I was really shocked, and I was shocked, and in a way, the thing that sticks with me is a sense of, okay, if they're prepared to do this, what are the limits? What are actually the limits of what the police are supposed to do? And I felt a sense of, I mean, as I say, I'm not naive about the police, but I think that on the one hand, we're having these negotiations with them about how to organise demonstrations, which appear to be in good faith. On the other hand, they are at the same time trying to manipulate, not just spy on, but actually manipulate our organisation, as I came to understand, for it to do things that are illegal or move towards the possibility of illegality. So, it's quite a moment when you realise that in reality. I mean, I know you see it in films and stuff, and you kind of maybe think that it happens, but when it's in front of you, it's quite a shocking moment.
Thank you. Paragraph 8.8, page 44 of your witness statement, you say that many UCOs have exaggerated the danger they were in from activists, and you point out that no one really went near Simon Wellings once it was discovered he was a UCO, and this was even the case when you knew about it, but he'd not finished his deployment and he was still around as Simon Wellings. Did you see him at all again after the discovery?
Never.
In your view, was he ever at any risk from anyone in any of the three organisations you were involved in?
No. And if you'd known the people who met up with him and confronted him, you'd realise why. I mean, some of them, even after he broke down apparently and started crying and in that meeting and so on and so forth, some of them still believed that actually still doubted that he was an undercover police officer, and I think met up with him afterwards and had lunch with him and felt sorry for him. I mean, the idea that anyone was going to do anything, throw him into the Thames or something is a joke, really.
No, and you point out that the SDS's own document at MPS 052683 at tab B90 of the bundle, we don't need to bring it up, but that considered the risk of physical injury to him to be low. I just want to finally ask you about a little bit more about the impact of that this has had upon you. At paragraphs 12.3 to 12.4, pages 51 to 52 of your witness statement, which deals with the effect and impact on you and other globalised resistance, particularly members, of finding out he was a UCO. You say there was disbelief initially and then betrayal. Do you still feel like that you were betrayed?
Yeah, I definitely do feel a sense of personal betrayal. I think it's very odd to be relatively close to someone who you kind of realise suddenly was, in a way, a fictional character, and that's in itself a disturbing thing. I know many people have been through much worse experiences, but it definitely had an impact not just on me but on people around us. But I think there's other things too. I think there's, as I say, a sense of there's a sense of doubt that is thrown on the way in which official society is relating to what is a legitimate protest movement, and I think it inevitably had on many people a kind of radicalising effect, because it makes you feel paranoid. It makes you feel it's disorientating, disturbing, but it also makes you feel, okay, so we're living in a society in which state institutions are, in a way which, at least internally in the police force and so forth, is known about, are being weaponised in very, very sinister and disturbing ways to spy on organisations. And it's very important, I think, in terms of thinking about the impact that this has had, to reflect on what the purpose of Simon Wellings' engagement was, because I don't think it was mainly about spying. Because really this information, as I hope I've established, has been fairly worthless in terms of avoiding any kind of criminality or any such behaviour. What it's about, it seems to me, I can only draw the conclusion, is as I say, helping to generate a false narrative about what various movement and organisations and campaigns are really about, providing false evidence that can be used by the police and possibly wider forces to demonise and criminalise these movements. But most disturbingly of all, it seems to me, to disrupt and even potentially sabotage, because I think the fact that I've obviously, ever since this the whole thing happened, I've come to believe that Simon Wellings was trying to make us do things that we weren't automatically going to do, and trying to make us go closer to criminality and therefore cause problems for the organisation potentially of all different kinds. But also, one of the things that really struck me in reading some of the material here is particularly the final note that I think was circulated.
Yes, I think I know the one you mean. Shall we go to it? MPS 00362 65 at page 3, please. So this is not in Mr. Nineham's bundle, but is in HM118's bundle at tab B68. And it's the second bullet point down I'd like to look at. This is, so that we orient ourselves, the file note written by DCI Michael Dell after the discovery, after Simon Wellings had been outed, as it were, as a UCO by members of Globalised Resistance, and under a heading that's on the previous page entitled Now Onwards, bullet point 2 on this page 3 says, consider with C Squad whether we should leave GR intact or through RW mount a destructive operation. Is that what you were referring to a moment ago? And so what's your concern about the objective of Simon Wellings' deployment in terms of a destructive operation?
Well, that is the note that I was referring to. I mean, I think that bullet point barely needs any commentary. I mean, whether or not that was what Simon Wellings was up to that point doing, it's quite clear, and this is presumably written by someone senior in the SDS or someone with oversight of the SDS, who is discussing how to respond to a changed situation in terms of an undercover operation, that he could even suggest, in a very casual way, different options, and one of them being mount a destructive operation against Globalised Resistance. So this isn't about surveillance just, this isn't about spying just, this isn't even about just demonisation. This is clearly about putting people into organisations who at least have the potential or the capacity to, in his words, destroy them. What that actually might have meant in practice, who knows? I know that Simon Wellings carried on having meetings with various people, even after he was outed, who thought that myself and others, including Guy, who uncovered him, were being too harsh or whatever. Maybe he was trying to create divisions or whatever, but it seems to me that this document makes it absolutely crystal clear that, at least potentially, what this operation was about could have been an intervention in a legal organisation in order to destroy it. And I find that deeply sinister, deeply troubling. And as I say, I think all of these events have the effect, actually, apart from anything else, of making people feel very, very alienated from state institutions, very, very concerned about the future of democracy, and to have a sense that there's something going on under the surface of society that is really very toxic and very dangerous.
Thank you. Those are all the questions I have for you, Mr. Nineham. Is there anything else you wish to add?
No, I don't think there is.
I'm very grateful. Sir, I don't think there are any Rule 10s, but would you rise briefly so that I can confirm and to see if there's any re-examination?
Certainly. Before I rise, I do have a question of you, and I'd be grateful for your assistance. Can we take the 20th of November 2003 demonstration when 300,000 people marched from central London to Trafalgar Square via Whitehall? You were a chief steward there. As I've understood your evidence, one of the things that you did was to notify the police about the forthcoming demonstration. You nod your head. I'm afraid that doesn't go on a transcript.
That's
yes,
a question. Okay.
It's a question.
Not just notify the police. We had serial meetings with the police before the demonstration. We had a big negotiation about the route. And as I say, in the weeks before, we had a very, very public dispute about whether or not the demonstration was to be allowed down Whitehall, which included, by the way, a press conference outside Scotland Yard with 100 journalists. It became a kind of, in a minor way, a sort of cause célèbre. Should they be allowed to go past Downing Street when George Bush was in London? So, very detailed negotiations with the police on all aspects of the demo.
And is that with uniformed police?
Yes. With senior police officers and police at all different levels, in-person meetings in Scotland Yard.
I don't know whether you can remember now at what level of rank the police officers were with whom you spoke.
I don't know, but very senior, because this was, as I say, the police themselves told us that one of the reasons, the reason why they were trying to disallow us from going down Whitehall is that they'd been asked by the CIA that we shouldn't be able to go, that we shouldn't march past Downing Street when George Bush was visiting. What actually happened was they relented and let us through, and then George Bush's time agenda was switched, so he wasn't actually there as it happened. But these were the high-level meetings that were reported in national newspapers and that took place at Scotland Yard with senior officers.
And what, if any, communications did you have with the police officers controlling the march, or at any rate observing it? What, if any, communication did you have with them on the day?
Regular. When we started to form up in the morning, the police would have come over to us and talked to us about, just checked everything was all right. There was there's normally a police liaison person. And I specifically, as I think I said in what I was saying earlier, is that there was a certain level of tension on the day, partly no doubt because the CIA were on their case and George Bush was in town, but also maybe because of Simon Welling's false intelligence that we were going to do something other than what we said we were going to do. And it was quite tense in Trafalgar Square. And I remember getting, I think from the Bronze Commander, I was getting phone calls every 15 minutes. Say, is everything all right? Whatever. I think they were very, very jumpy for absolutely no reason.
Thank you. We now have a process, as always, when there's a short break to enable any questions to be put to counsel to the inquiry, and if she thinks it right, to put to you, and there may be re-examination, but it won't be long.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.
Thank you, sir. There are no Rule 10 questions, but there is one short point on re-examination.
Of course.
Mr. Nineham, this is a question arising from the Chair's question that he just asked. The George Bush demonstration. When you had these pre-demonstration meetings with senior police officers, did you give them an indication of the likely number of demonstrators who would be coming?
Yeah. As always, we had a discussion about what we thought was going to happen. And funnily enough, as I remember, we had to try and persuade the police that it was going to be as big as it was. I think because it was a weekday demonstration, which is very rare to have big weekday demonstrations. In fact, it turned out to be the biggest weekday demonstration on any subject in British history. And we obviously, because we're the organisers, we know how many coaches are coming, we're getting a sense of it. And we were sort of saying to them, they were like slightly sceptical. We were saying, no, this is going to be absolutely huge. And, you know, we do really want you to understand that. And partly that had a kind of a relevance to the whole debate about Whitehall, because what we were saying to the police was, funny enough, in direct contradiction to what Simon Wenning said, we were saying to the police, look, if you don't let us go down Whitehall, you're effectively stopping the march happening because there's no other route to get up to Trafalgar Square that's practical. So you're talking about a really big crisis here, not involving a few thousand activists, but involving really large numbers of people, a bit like there had been over Hyde Park in the February earlier in the year. So we were saying, if you don't let us down Whitehall, then we are moving into territory which actually we don't want to move into, which is that people may feel that, you know, they have to do something about a restriction on our right to protest. So that was a robust discussion, shall we say, which spilled over, as I say, into a public campaign. And we were saying, no, this is going to be massive. Really believe us, because really this war is very, very unpopular. It was just as the war was really starting to become, you know, at the beginning of the war, there was a little bit of a kind of back our boys. Suddenly there was, by this stage, people realised what a disaster it was. So yeah, that was the argument that we had with the police, actually, about numbers. And I have to say we turned out to be right.
Thank you very much. No further questions.
May I thank you, as I do all who have attended voluntarily, as you have. You've informed me, a person who's never been on a political demonstration in his life, a bit about how these things work. I'm very grateful to you for doing so, and also for the evidence that you've given about undercover policing.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. We will resume on Monday with the evidence of Emily Apple. I hope we will start at 10. I cannot say for certain precisely what form the evidence will take or how it will be transmitted, if at all. That remains to be seen in the light of how Ms. Apple feels on the morning and on the day.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you all.